Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're doing something a little bit different. This is the very first episode of Ask Questing Beast. So throughout this episode, I am going to be taking questions that have been submitted to me by both patrons and non-patrons alike and seeing if I can find something useful to say about them. Of course, patron questions are going to be prioritized, but I will also look through all of the questions that were submitted over on the community tab a little while ago and see if there's anything interesting in there that I can answer as well. Now, if you want to get one of your questions answered possibly in the future, you can leave it as a comment down below on this video, or of course, become a patron because they're always going to get priority. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Number 1, LFOSR asks, where do you typically find your news about new or upcoming RPG releases? So my main sources of information are mostly the blogosphere and some Discord channels. I have Feedly, which is basically a newer version of Google Reader, the old defunct blog reader. And I've just loaded it up with hundreds of OSR blogs. There's way more of them than I thought there would be, and I keep finding new ones. So it's just packed with OSR blogs, and I have a huge feed of just every new post that comes out. I think this keeps me pretty well tied into what's going on in the old school scene. And then if you combine that with stuff just on Discord or other small OSR forums like the OSR subreddit, then I pretty much hear most of the stuff that's coming up. Also, a lot of people just email me and ask me to send their books to me, so I find out that way as well. Next up, we have Alex Dzuricky. Asks, one of your earliest videos was about Burning Wheel RPG. Well, that's a blast from the past. Are you still a fan? Would you still recommend it? Personally, I like the game more and more, but it seems at odds with the kind of games you recommend. So yes, Burning Wheel is one of the earliest role-playing games that I read in full, or read most of and really got into. I discovered it back when it was in its second edition, I think. I just found a PDF of it somewhere. And I was really hooked by how interconnected it was and how fleshed out it was and how everything was part of this elaborate system that all just hooked together to have this really intense focus on telling character-driven stories. So I just found that fascinating from the very beginning. I eventually got into Burning Wheel Gold, and I even have the blue codex that went along with it. That has a lot more information. I still find it a fascinating system and really beautiful in its own way. But more and more my focus in role-playing is not towards telling these intense character-driven stories. I find them to be kind of stressful and hard to run. I like a lot more now this more open exploration-focused type of role-playing game. Burning Wheel, I did play a couple sessions of it. I started a campaign, I think I started 2 campaigns actually, both of which fizzled out in 2 or 3 sessions, I think. And I think that was because the game master who was running it really had a hard time. It is a very dense system, and it needs to have every single player at the table, needs to have a copy of the book probably, and have read at least most of it, and be very committed to looking up rules and making sure that the whole system is fitting together. So there's a real intensity there that is hard to find with most role-playing game books. So there's some caveats there that I would give to anyone who's trying to run it now. However, back when I was into it, I created a cheat sheet for Burning Wheel that takes most of the core system, which is not well organized. It's scattered across the entire book in all sorts of different chapters. And I organized all of those rules and I put them in a sequential logical order on just 2 or 3 pieces of paper. And I think it's still on my blog, questingblog.com, where you can download a copy of that. So if you do play Burning Wheel, I would probably check that out. It's going to make things a lot easier. Next question, Josh Bennett asks, what is a good way to introduce modern gamers to OSR ideals? Or is the onus on the DM to run the game world / metagame in an OSR way? Well, in any sort of game, you're going to need to have both the game master and the players on board, of course. OSR games are very much dependent on the game master. They are creating the world and they're creating the kind of environment and atmosphere that is conducive to the adventuring style, where it's more about exploration and problem solving. But you do have to have players on board as well, obviously. I don't recommend just dropping this sort of thing on top of players. You really have to introduce it to them, and you have to explain what they're going to be getting into. They have to be okay with a game that is very neutral, in the sense that it's not really in favor of them, it's not really against them. It's just a world, and they're going to have to try and survive in it and think of their own way to achieve their own goals and create their own goals a lot of the time. So it requires a lot of proactivity on the player's part. It requires players who enjoy just seeing a situation and then thinking of something crazy that they would like to do in that situation and then figuring out a way to do it. And that's not everybody. So you have to know who you're playing with and make sure that they are in the right mindset for that. Brandon Waite says, I love the OSR scene and would prefer to use OSR as my primary system, but my group really likes 5e. What advice do you have for converting OSR stat blocks to 5e? Well, I mean, most D&D monsters are going to be very intercompatible with each other, except maybe 4th edition. I know very little about 4th edition, so I really can't say much about that. But they all have hit dice, they all have hit points, they all have armor class, and these are all roughly compatible to each other. But by the time you get to 3rd and 5th edition, my understanding is that there was a lot more hit point bloat. So if you wanted to keep OSR monsters or OSR stat blocks in line with 5e stuff, you probably want to increase the hit points. But this does slow down the game. It's one of the things I don't like about 5th edition is how long combat takes. So I'd be tempted to just leave the hit points mostly as it was, just to make combat go a little faster. There isn't a whole lot of big differences in terms of the game mechanics. I mean, you have saves, for example. Saves work very differently in OSR stuff versus 5th edition stuff. You can just ballpark it by looking at a OSR monster and trying to find a 5e monster that's very similar to it and just give it similar stats. That's probably the fastest way to do it. One way that I do it in Knave, which I think is pretty effective, is you can take the monster's hit die and just roll a d20 plus the number of hit dice that they have and try and get 16 or higher and just use that for pretty much all of their saves. And if the monster would be really bad at something, like it's a giant monster and you don't think it would have a good dexterity save, then just roll a d20 and don't add anything to it. It's a quick and dirty solution, but I think it's going to work most of the time. I mean, players don't really know monster stats by and large. So the way that you run monsters behind the screen is really up to you. And I don't think players are going to notice much one way or another. Let's see. Sean asks, how do you feel about concrete versus abstract mechanics for OSR play? So 6 arrows versus D6 arrows, lockpicking, stealthing, acrobatic skills versus thief path, an inventory full of specific tools versus a nebulous tool bag that anything sensible can be pulled from. So that's a really interesting question. My preference is to make things very concrete and specific rather than abstract. I tend to go for abstract mechanics only in situations where it would be just a huge pain and slow down the game to deal with more concrete rules. So I would go for more just actually counting arrows. Now, caveat, I usually don't count arrows in my game, but that's mostly because I forget about it. I just don't think about it. I probably should do that a bit more. But especially when it comes to things like equipment and the tools that you're carrying, in my opinion, it's really important to actually list what those things are. Because I really enjoy it when players feel smart for having packed the right things. And I also really like it when they're in a situation and they check their inventories and they don't quite have the right tool for that job, but they have a miscellaneous bunch of other strange tools, and then they figure out how to MacGyver their way through the situation. I really love that. That is so much fun. It's one of the best parts of D&D for me personally. And you just don't get situations like that when they can pull out whatever reasonable tool that they might need. So that's really up to your personal preference. But I like forcing more player decisions, and making things more concrete tends to push things in that direction, I think. Ryan D. Ropp asks, what RPG rule system taught you the most about how to think about tabletop RPG rule sets in general and how they affect organic roleplay and why? So the biggest influences on me, I guess. Early on, I read a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games. I really enjoyed playing World of Dungeons, actually. But in terms of the OSR, one of the biggest influences on me was, no surprise, Into the Odd, and then later on Electric Bastion Land. Chris McDowell is extremely good, especially on his blog, about taking these concepts of how to game master things and then boiling them down into these pithy little sentences that stick in your brain and actually make a big difference in how you run the game. So he was a huge influence on me. But also other OSR manuals and stuff that explained the OSR in terms of like what the designers were thinking. So stuff like, I think it's called Philotomy's Musings. It's a PDF that you can find online pretty easily that goes through original Dungeons and Dragons and says, maybe there was a reason why all of these rules are written the way they are. Because of course they were. But then it breaks it down so you can see the thought process going on in early role-playing games. And that was hugely influential in understanding what these authors were going for. Let's see, what else do we have here? Hui Yi asks, have you seen The Headhunter? It's the closest thing of an OSR D&D movie that I've ever seen. Do you have any movies that you recommend as good inspirations for creating OSR D&D settings or adventures? Thanks and keep up the great work. Thank you, Hui. So I have not actually seen that movie, but there are a number of movies that spring to mind that I feel influence the way I think about fantasy for sure. The biggest one off the top of my head is Time Bandits, which is an absolutely fantastic Terry Gilliam children's adventure movie about a bunch of angels that really come across as dwarves, basically, that have stolen the map of creation, found behind me on the wall, from God, and are using it to find all of the holes in creation, to travel through time and steal stuff from different time periods. And they drag a kid along with them. It's absolutely great. It is wild, it's crazy, it's very gonzo, and it's all about the characters finding themselves in one weird situation after another and figuring out how to get out of that. So it has a picaresque quality about it that I think fits really well with the ethos of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's see what else we have here. How would you do overland travel? What rule set handles it the best? I haven't done a lot of really detailed overland travel. My games tend to be very dungeon focused, but one of my favorite rule sets that I've read was actually in one of the Wormskin zines. Which is a zine for the Dolmenwood setting. Now, the official Dolmenwood setting hasn't been released yet. That's going to be kickstarted hopefully soon. I'm really looking forward to that. But the overview of the rules that I found in the zine had all sorts of rules for camping, what time of day it was, were you close to a road, were you off in a forest, different types of hazards and monsters that would approach you possibly at different times of day. It was really great. It had a lot of detail to it, and there was a nice procedure that you could go through that I thought added a lot of choices and interesting consequences based on your choices. So I would check that out. What else? Michael UK asks, how do you resolve chase scenes and social encounters? So chase scenes, I keep it pretty simple. So usually if a character has a faster move rate, then they're just going to escape. In a situation where you have multiple characters that are about the same speed, it would probably come down to constitution, because it's really about endurance, right? How long you can keep this up. I might do a series of constitution checks and throw some sort of obstacle at each stage that gave players a decision, right? Do they want to try and take a shortcut? Do they want to knock something off of a nearby table to try and trip their person who's chasing them, and so on, just to add a little bit of variety there. But I wouldn't make it really extended. I find that to be a little bit of a pain. In terms of social encounters, I don't really mind necessarily doing roles for social encounters as long as the player's choices and their role playing is a much bigger factor. So you can do things like the encounter roll, not the encounter roll, the reaction roll, which is a classic rule from old school D&D, where if you meet a monster, you roll to see how friendly it is to you. That's a kind of social encounter roll. But also, if the players have a high charisma or something like that, I might give them a bit of a boost just to increase the NPC or monster's initial disposition to them. But I really like having most of the impact come from the player's decisions. So if they're persuading the monster or the NPC, how are they persuading them? What leverage do they have over them? And then make judgments based on that. Alex Oganezov asks, your thoughts on virtual tabletops. What would an ideal one be for you? So I don't play very much online. As a result, during the pandemic, I haven't played very much at all. But when I have, it's usually just been over Zoom. If I needed to use a virtual tabletop, I would want something pretty minimal and something more toy-like, where I could have miniatures on a flat table so I could figure out the relative distance of one to another. But apart from that, I wouldn't want a whole ton of detail. I find it fiddly and I don't feel like it adds very much. And I feel like it just slows the game down. When you have these very detailed virtual tabletops with, full color maps and so on, the real impulse is to stay there for long periods of time because there's so much work that's been put into creating this one scene. However, in my OSR play, I tend to move pretty quickly from one situation to another, from one scene to another. And so I would want something very fast and loose. I think tabletop simulator is a pretty good choice for this because it's just a table. You can virtually slap some miniatures down on them and very easily just shuffle them and move them around the table. Maybe put blocks down to represent different obstacles. You can put some virtual trees down, and that's about all that you need. I would want it to be really fast and simple. Derek Morrill asks, where do you get your inspiration when writing adventures? So for me, at least recently, I've been working on The Waking of Willoughby Hall, which is my Kickstarter adventure. It's nearing completion, finally. And my biggest inspiration is just reading other adventures. One of my favorite writers is actually Gavin Norman, who did Dolmenwood and Old School Essentials. So a lot of people praise Old School Essentials, but I think that Gavin's actually one of the best adventure writers working in the OSR right now. Mostly because his adventures are not over the top in any significant way. They're very clean. They're very easy to understand. They're like 50-70% vanilla, so they're easy to process. But then that 30% extra takes them over the top. And there's a great feel to them. There's a nice twist. There's like one or two cool set pieces that is just enough to get players really excited while still being able to engage with it. So one of my favorite adventures of his is Winter's Daughter, which I've run several times now, and I've had a great time each time. So I've been going back and rereading Winter's Daughter and just thinking, what about this adventure was so fun to run? And then trying to emulate that in the stuff that I'm writing. Let's see. So Dragon Shade Studio asks, what do you think is the most compelling reason for gamers who are most familiar with the latest styles of play to try the OSR style? So this relates back to something I said before, and that's mostly the style of play, as is mentioned here. You really want to pitch to players that this is not about the nostalgia pretending that you're in the 80s. That won't mean a lot to most people. You have to pitch it to them that this is about adventure and surviving by your own wits. And I think that particular thing is missing from most other major role-playing games. You do find stuff like Call of Cthulhu where like life is cheap and your giant monster can eat you pretty quickly and that's expected. But even in games like Call of Cthulhu, you're not expected to survive. You're not expected to win by cleverness. It's more about discovering how you die. And in the OSR, it takes that... Let me put it this way. The OSR in its ideal form feels like what I imagined a role-playing game to be before I started playing Dungeons & Dragons. Because I started off playing Pathfinder and 5th edition, and it didn't feel like how I imagined. It didn't feel like I was in an imaginary world where my choices had consequences. It felt like there was just a kind of a scripted path. Even if the Dungeon Master wasn't trying to railroad me, the system itself felt like it was kind of plodding along in one direction. And the OSR threw all of that out the window. It was light, it was fast, it was brutal, and I could do whatever I want, and those choices mattered and rippled outwards. So that's the big thing for me. Eric Martin says, what is your favorite mechanic of Dungeon Crawl Classics that you use in your games? I don't use a lot of Dungeon Crawl Classics mechanics per se, but there are some things that I really like that I have used in the past. One of them is the way that fighters get to do stunts all the time. That is a great way to make fighters a lot more interesting, where every time they attack, maybe. In Dungeon Crawl Classics, it's not every time, but where most of the times that they attack, they can do something else like disarming them, blinding an opponent, kicking them over. Having fighters being able to do that all the time makes fighters feel totally badass. And that's missing from most role-playing games, including 5th edition. Or at least they try and mechanize it. They turn it into certain feats and certain things that you're allowed to do, whereas DCC is just make it up and it'll probably work as long as it's not outside the realm of possibility. So you feel like a competent fighter as a result. I really like that. Monkey Work asks, of the common mega dungeons, which would you recommend to most DMs to try? Same question of the major hex crawls. I don't run a lot of mega dungeons. I usually write shorter dungeons or run shorter dungeons that are like 1 to 3 sessions. But Barrow Maze is a classic. It's nice. It's big. It's not too complicated. Some people think that's a little bit too dry because it's all undead. But it does have a lot of flavor. And if you like crawling through barrows that are all done on one level and have lots of different interesting zones with different things in them. There's definitely secrets to uncover. It's very deadly, and it's easier to use than I would say most mega dungeons that I've seen out there, which can be a little bit annoying in terms of their layout. Same question for hex crawls. I haven't run a lot of huge hex crawls either. But my favorite hex crawl is Dolmenwood, which again is not out yet, but you can find bits of it throughout the Wormskein zine. I've used different locations from that hex crawl to run people through. Christopher Jones asks, hey, Questing Beast, thanks for everything you do. Thank you, Christopher. I love the videos. My question is, why don't are we seeing more OSR style modularity in more modern or mainstream games? What about the OSR lends itself so well to modularity, and how might we go about getting more of it in other styles of games? Is it even possible? Thanks again. I think we are. The OSR is, 15 years old, really. It's really only 10 to 5 years old in terms of it actually getting some sort of traction. But even in 5th edition, I think we're seeing more setting books that have more of an OSR mentality. The one that I was flipping through recently was the one set on the Magic the Gathering universe. That's all one big city, Ravnica. It wasn't really an OSR setting, but it definitely had much more of a toolkit approach, where instead of just going on and talking about the setting, it gave you lots of concrete things that you can mix and match and throw at the players. And I really like that. I would like to see much more of that. But it's still not that common when you see a lot of these mainstream books. And I think that's because most of these companies have been producing these types of settings and adventures, sometimes for decades. And they know what has sold well for them in the past, and they feel hesitant about changing that up too much, which is understandable. But increasingly, I think players really, really like the modularity and the content-focused approach of OSR products, where it's not about giving you lore, it's about giving you stuff that you can use. And it's really up to you how you're going to use it. Same thing with the modularity of the rules of the OSR. The OSR has all of the rules that you find for how characters run and how you run a dungeon and so on. They're all very independent of one another. There really isn't a unifying mechanic the way that you would find in 5th edition, and the different rules aren't hooked into each other very much at all. So you can yank them out and put them in very easily. It's very interchangeable. Whereas the more modern style games, the focus on having a unified mechanic is usually very strong. It's hard to find any modern games that are just a hodgepodge of different rules. They have like one way that you roll dice and everything is connected to that. And that tends to make things less modular, because when you move one of those rules to a different system, you're going to have to change the way that it's resolved as well. Someone asks, how do you think combat should be ordered? I guess you're asking about initiative here. I like to keep initiative as simple as possible. The process of adding a phase to the game where you're doing rolls or you're doing any sort of mini game, the result of which is just telling you who goes first, is a huge waste of time to me. I really can't be bothered with it at all. So there's a couple solutions here. You could just have you go around the table, and that's always your turn order. I think that's a good solution. You can do stuff like both sides roll a die. If your side rolls higher, then all of your characters go, and then all of the enemies go, and you just go back and forth. Both of those are good solutions. I know some people really advocate for simultaneous initiative. I know that Professor Dungeon Master over on Dungeon Craft advocates for that, which I think is a pretty good solution. That works pretty well if you're doing more contested rolls. So you have both sides can attack each other and they both roll to see who wins. But you can still make it work even if one side is rolling against armor class and you go back and forth. Anything to strip out a whole phase of the game which is just busy work as far as I can tell. I've never played a game where I thought, wow, it was really satisfying to roll initiative and go through that whole process. That's never happened to me. Last question here that I'm going to look at today. Coghead asks, I'm moving away from 5e. I want to get my players more in the OSR mindset than linking them to long articles or PDFs to read. Is there some basic knowledge that I can share with them to help get them rolling? So I've mentioned a little bit about this before, so you can take some of my advice that I've mentioned previously in this video. Most of the things I'm thinking of are PDFs. Not all of them are very long. A good short one is called the Principia Apocrypha, which I contributed to along with a couple other DMs. You can find that in the description below. It's not very long, and I think it summarizes the core points of the OSR in a way that's very easy to digest. Alternatively, you could look at Maze Rats, my own game. I have a very short, just like 1 or 2 page section on how to run the game at the back that I think summarizes the OSR pretty well. All of those could be really good options. All right, that's all the questions that I have for today. As I mentioned before, if you have even more that you want me to answer, put them down in the description below, or you can join me over on Patreon with my other wonderful patrons, because I'll always answer their questions first. And also, if you want to get in the running for any giveaways that I do in the future, I do giveaways every so often. Make sure you're subscribed to the Questing Beast newsletter, which you can also find down below. I use that email list whenever I do giveaways. And you'll also get monthly awesome newsletters that keep you up with everything happening in the old school scene. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.